Conversations in Society. We talk racism, culture, politics, and economics, the issues that matter to you. Well, we are here for part 2 of our podcast looking at the general elections and what that actually means for people like us, like what's going on with racial equality and how much is that important to the various parties. Well, we started off on a good start and we're here to talk about some really hard topics that can't be missed off. So just to introduce myself again, I'm Danielle, founder of In Society, a racial equality organization, and host of this podcast. Thank you for listening to Conversations in Society. I'm joined with Leah Mahon. Leah Mahon is a journalist, previously worked with The Voice newspaper, BBC Radio 5, and is currently working with local government, in that sector. So, hi, Leah.
Hi, everyone.
Well, I mean, we might as well just get stuck in. We've got like a really heavy next topic. But it's a very important one. It's one that, we can't skip over. And that is police and crime. So Leah has been looking at what the Conservatives and Labour parties, I guess kind of the two big opposing parties, and what their manifestos pledge in regards to all issues. And I've been looking at the Green and Lib Dems. So Leah, do you want to kick us off with what are the Conservatives and Labour talking about when it comes to crime and policing?
Yeah, sure, definitely. Across the board, and I think just in our general news, knife crime and violence against women and girls has been a huge, huge talking point. And one thing that's left a lot of communities quite on edge in terms of how they're being policed. So in Labour's manifesto, they have sort of promised to sort of take back our streets in their manifesto. I'm kind of really playing into the idea that policing has been out of control under the current Tory government. So they're proposing things as tough new penalties for offenders, such as in knife crime, for example. So a huge plan to get knives off the streets, involving multiple communities, not just in London as well. We've seen that the knife crime epidemic is particularly bad in the West Midlands, as recent stats recently revealed. Involving there's been an incident of knives, shocking, about a blade per 100,000 population. So about 108 instances of knife crime in the West Midlands, followed very closely by London. So Metropolitan Police Borough reported at about 165. And then just after that, we've got Cleveland in Yorkshire at 143. And as part of combating this problem of knife crime, they promised to strengthen rules around, preventing knife crime sales online, as well as the particular sort of crackdown on zombie knives, which I'm sure you've probably seen, are those really, really, really terrible looking knives, which basically are being created to cause more damage. There's no real use for you to have that type of knife in your possession.
Yeah, what is it even for? Do you know? What's its use?
That's why it's so concerning, because I have yet to meet anybody else for police.
What is it for? Is it cutting bark, wood?
No, because that's not usually what you use. For that type of activity, you would use probably a saw or an axe.
Look, or I don't know.
Some type of electric thing. So there's a lot of rhetoric of these types of knives being sort of manufactured with that in mind, which is why sort of the crackdown on those online sales on the black market is a very, very big thing for Labour. So they're really wanting to go back to the good old days of policing. I think we all grew up knowing about sort of the policewomen that used to roam around our neighbourhood. I certainly remember them in my younger days. And we don't see that so much in sort of local neighbourhood policing and neighbourhood watch signs that we used to see up and about. So Labour are really wanting to return to those good old days of being on the beat as a policeman, a friendly policeman, really going back into that idea of policing in this country is by consent, and really
Mm-hmm.
playing into that idea of have a community feeling safe again as a way to rebuild trust. As we know, trust in general across the board for policing has been at its most fractured. Some key instances that come to mind are the sort of discrimination cases that came out of Charing Cross police station. We saw, of course, the Casey review that came out
Yeah.
in 2022. The revelations that we had behind that, and how the Metropolitan Police was still institutionally racist 30 years after it was first found to be just that, but also had that extra whammy of it being institutionally sexist and homophobic. In particular, I really want to draw on sort of that low level of trust in Black and minority ethnic communities, because we do know from ongoing stats across boroughs, even here where I live in Manchester, that ethnic minority people are being over-policed, in particular Black communities. The
Yeah.
Casey review found that Black communities were described as being over-policed and underprotected, and had a severe case of generational mistrust. So we definitely see a big onus in that in Labour's manifesto, and sort of bringing a community together and community cohesion. Just to pull back into the Casey review. Yeah.
1 second, just before you go into that, is there anything from Labour in regards to implementing the recommendations of the Casey review?
We have not seen direct sort of direct manifesto coverage of how implementing what was found in the Casey review. And I think for a lot of people that would be very concerning, particularly Black communities, that that review in itself, in my opinion, wasn't very massively acknowledged by the parties across the board, not even from our own Met Commissioner, Sir Mark Rowley. He still refused to admit that the Metropolitan Police was institutionally racist. That's a whole other conversation in itself. We only really saw Sadiq Khan come out and actually say, I back this report fully. So we haven't seen across the part from my research into Conservative and Labour a real backing of the findings in the Casey review. Arguably, we might
carry on.
I was going to say, arguably, we might find some type of compensation in that in regards to the Race Equality Act they're wanting to unroll. We might find some ways in that might help benefit Black people when discrimination cases do come up, but no solid sort of recommendations in regards to that.
Yeah, absolutely. I think at this point, particularly for me as an individual, what I want to see at this moment in time is commitment. So there's a lot of research that's taken place, a lot of reviews that have taken place, a lot of recommendations that have been offered. And I think at this stage, we want to see some real commitment to looking at and implementing recommendations after all these countless reviews, especially when it comes to policing. So just before you continue on to the next point where Labour and Conservatives are, I just want to draw on what Lib Dem and Green have to say to some of what you've brought up so far. So Lib Dem also have acknowledged knife crime and youth violence. What they've said is they want to have a series of items, including investing, in youth services, developing approaches to identify and treat the risk factors rather than the symptoms, and they want to get more collaborative approaches going in terms of working towards this issue. So that is getting the police, teachers, health professionals, youth workers, social services, all working together on this issue. The Lib Dems have also recognised the Casey review. However, they've gone a step further than what you're telling me Labour has at this moment. They said that they require the Home Secretary, the Mayor of London, and the Metropolitan Police Commissioner to draw up an urgent plan to implement the recommendations of the Casey review. And so that's there. And to tackle racism, sexism, homophobia, and encourage other police forces to do so where appropriate. So it's quite interesting you put together and show that at the moment, the West Midlands seems to be leading in knife crime incidents than the UK, if you put it in terms of into proportion. That's wild. Yeah. So the fact that the Lib Dems are currently focused on London, well, anyone's focused on London when it seems West Midlands seem to be the most highlighted point when it comes to knife crime at the moment. It really needs to be really focused on.
Yeah, well, in particular, have stressed that this is a community thing. This is a community issue. They haven't really pinpointed London in their manifesto. I think
Yeah.
so long, everybody thought London was sort of, and it was for quite a few years until the last up until 2022. We've seen the West Midlands surpass it. You know, West Midlands Police Force was put into special measures in November for struggling, sort of falling below their sort of standard of policing and investigating. So that might have something to do with a lot of what we're seeing here, in terms of how crime is playing out. Just drawing back to some other key points in policing, violence against women and girls has been a very big thing across the parties for both Labour and Conservative. And of course, that draws back to obviously the horrific murder of Sarah Everard, and that really put sort of the everyday violence that women deal with across the board. But that was also a very sort of a difficult case in particular because it really put the trust of policing, particularly for women, at a very, very vulnerable point. The Labour are proposing that, you know, a specialist rape unit is in every police force. Shocking to know that's not even the case. We know that prosecutions for rapes are incredibly low. I think about less than 1%. Are actually prosecuted in courts in England and Wales. And a lot of victims are dropping out of the criminal justice process because of those delays. And we found in the Casey report, of course, we will remember that, you know, the case it found that the Met was also institutionally sexist as well. We read some horrific stories there of rape victims, you know, being failed in the sense of their evidence was being stored in fridges that were left broken. And essentially their cases had failed even before they had a chance to really bring their alleged perpetrators to justice. And so we saw all these horrific cases coming out, and which Labour are really promising to deal with. They want to fast track rape cases and work with specialist courts at every Crown Court location across England and Wales. Just want to get into some really quick stats on sort of just to really reflect how bad the prosecution rates are in particular. This is research that I reported on The Voice. Between 2016 and 2020, 37 police forces across England, Wales, and Northern Ireland charged alleged perpetrators in 6.7% of cases, where, for example, the domestic violence victim was white and just 5.5% where the victim was black. So we're also really looking into this looked across the board ethnically in the disproportionate treatment. And this is something that Labour do acknowledge, that Black and minority ethnic women are really being dealt an unfair hand in the criminal justice system in the way they're dealt with by police. And we know that's been being tackled even in this current government with the College of Policing, etc. Different matters that are taking place in regards to that. And overall, yes, I
was just to pull on that. So the Lib Dems also have addressed domestic abuse in their manifesto. What they've pledged is to embed domestic abuse specialists in every police and 999 operator assistance centre. That's as far as it's gone so far in regards to domestic abuse. But it's also acknowledged that there needs to be stronger stronger touch points for people who are experiencing it to get in contact and to be supported. I wish I could add a little bit more here about what Green has said in regards to everything we've talked about so far, but all I could kind of find from their manifesto is, and I quote, "help the public trust the police more." So that's as far as it goes where Green is concerned. How it's quite ambiguous. It's not really giving me much on how they plan to do that. But yeah, I thought I would just add that there. That has been mentioned.
Yeah. And just to go on to a little bit about what the Conservatives have proposed in regards to tackling crimes, they very much follow Labour in the sense that they really want to bring back that neighbourhood policing. And stats from the manifesto, they claim that violent crime has fallen by 44% since 2010, and neighborhood crime is down by about 48%. So allegedly, we're seeing some real improvement there. I think Labour would contest those figures. That crime has obviously soared underneath them. But this is what the Conservatives are claiming. They want to put at least 8,000 more police officers to patrol communities and catch criminals. So again, going back to that really old-fashioned on-the-beat policing that we all sort of grew up with, giving them new powers and tools to catch criminals, including technology like facial recognition, and powers to seize knives and track down stolen property. They're very big on the rhetoric of backing the police. So I don't think we're going to really see that hardline criticism that we saw, that almost a lot of people wanted to see from party leaders from off the back of the Casey review. They're very big on sort of the supporting the police and giving them that power back, and not sort of feeding into that rhetoric of defunding the police and kind of making them lose their powers. But they're very big on stressing the professional use of force, which we know is disproportionately used against Black communities in their manifesto. Very interesting. This is the first party I've seen who've also looked at National Crime Agency, who were working with the National Crime Agency and Counter-Terrorism Policing to introduce Martin's Law. And Martin's Law was introduced or proposed in tribute to Martin Hett, who was tragically killed alongside 21 others in the Manchester Arena attacks. So very, very interesting, and something that we haven't seen across the parties, something that is going to put more checks in place to reduce the terrorism risk at events like this. As we know from the inquiry, there was a litany of failures which led to his death and the death of many others. So I think that's a really, really strong point for the Conservatives and how they're pledging that. Oh, obviously, we saw, I know you can probably touch on this a little bit as well, that under the Conservatives, we saw the rape review come out in 2021. That revealed a 70% drop in rape prosecution cases in the last 4 years. So, like I said, less than 1% for rape prosecutions. The Conservatives have acknowledged this massive failure, and they've also pledged for more RASO units, so rape and sexually. I can't remember the name of it. I'm going to say that. You know what RASO units means? Rape, abuse, and serious sexual violence offenders units. RASO units. But they also pledge that there's not enough across the country. Again, shockingly enough. So bringing in more of those specialized units and really putting funding into ISVAs. So INDAs are independent sexual violence advisors, which we're currently massively lacking. They want to strengthen the law to punish predators with new offences such as stalking, controlling or coercive behaviour, non-fatal strangulation, and suffocation. Things that we've been seeing in the media a lot, such as revenge porn, non-consensual taking of pictures of women breastfeeding, and things that are often being excluded from the Sexual Violence Act, as well as the Domestic Abuse Act, even though it's quite newly sort of redone. I really wanted to stress what I also think is fantastic that Conservatives are doing. They're really looking at sort of legislating things that haven't really been a big talking point in terms of legal. They're really moving with the world we're living in now by looking at things like what's happening online in AI development. So, for example, the making of sexualized deepfake images of women and how that could be potentially damaging. Also worth stressing that I think we can trust Conservatives to actually implement this. It was actually under the Conservative government that we saw the first law rolled out for upskirting, and that was rolled out under their government after grassroots campaigning from a horrible story that happened to a young woman that sort of propelled her to really bring this into act. And that was not an actual law. You could not be prosecuted for that until about 2019, not officially anyway. And I just want to touch on as well that they're really making improvements in the Domestic Abuse Act, which now has a statutory definition. And that definition, as I mentioned, now includes a total of different areas of abuse that haven't been acknowledged historically, things like coercive control, emotional abuse, financial abuse. This is something that the Act is considering now, which will again inform sentencing decisions. So alleged perpetrators will be facing longer prison terms if they're accused of 1 or 2 or 3 of these crimes. So that is something I would say is really, really strong from the Conservatives for how they plan to tackle violence against women and girls. Worth stressing, though, that they haven't put an onus on how that affects Black and minority ethnic groups.
I was just about to bring that to the forefront, because what we're doing here is we're obviously looking at it through a racial lens, and how is this actually impacting racialized communities that have been campaigning to be included and to be recognized in all of the issues, all of the things, all the parts of society in which there has been, disparities, exclusion, and services that don't really meet the needs of specific communities. And with all these things, we do know under the Conservative government that Sister Space has been campaigning very, very hard to have the Valerie's Law implemented and recognizing what's happening for Black women. And I know you know this quite well, having done interviews with Sister Space and actually writing a few bits and bobs to do with, the trajectory of this
Valerie's Law,
campaign.
yeah, and
Absolutely.
how this,
So with that, there doesn't seem, from what you've said so far, a recognition from, did you say either Labour or Conservative, in, specialized units or by them and for services for, communities who probably don't necessarily have their needs met in mainstream ways of going about things. Has there been any mentions of
I'm not
basically
seeing that
racialized communities?
really. Yeah, I'm not really seeing that in terms
It's
of
just a blanket
really
approach.
taking those. Yeah, not in terms of this. We hear about giving back to the communities, etc., but I'm not seeing that real racialized and cultural focus, which is, why things like Valerie's Law
Acknowledgement
need to be
is the
acknowledged.
word, yeah.
But I will say that if that is in terms of voting decisions, if that is a law that we really want to see rolled out properly and really honing on that buy and force service, that Abina Apong Asa, I think I'm pronouncing her name correctly, or she has been a avid supporter of Valerie's Law, and she is a Labour Party member. And so I would say that maybe that could inform your voting decisions to know that she's been backing that law from since the time it was first unveiled, and she led the first debate in Parliament. So it's unfortunate to see that we're not really seeing that big onus on sort of how it affects women on a racial standpoint. But I think we've seen a general knowledge of it at least. But yeah,
of the
it's just
wider
further,
issue.
yeah, but yeah. And I just want to hone in on sort of, sorry.
Yeah, I was just going to say, and the same thing kind of goes when it comes to when we talked about policing and policing powers. It's very important to raise how much activism and campaigning has been done around the disproportionate use of stop and search, and how it's really impacting on, communities that are heavily located in locations where it's disproportionately having Black and brown families in that location. Sorry for the bad way of putting that. But essentially, that's been a massive concern for a very long time. Lib Dems, they have recognized the disproportionate use of stop and search. And that is something that they've put, blank face in their manifesto. So it is that acknowledgement of the years, the decades of campaigning that have happened by, Black communities and marginalized ethnic communities in regards to their concerns and lived experience of stop and search and its ineffectiveness, right? And its targeted behavior, its very racist agenda. So without having the acknowledgement of kind of some of these very long campaigning issues that have been highlighted time and time again. And we've seen protests in 2016 and back in 2020 in regards to these issues. And that's not highlighted in the manifesto. It is quite worrying on whether it is a good thing that all of these kind of pledges are actually going to serve all communities, or whether it's going to, again, just continue to ignore where concerns are in regards to having additional policing powers, where it has been said policing powers are not necessarily being used responsibly in terms of stop and search in this moment. Same thing again when it comes to mental health and the powers around that, and police having the power to detain people without their necessarily,
Mm.
you know, having any rights to say no. So yeah, it is quite concerning to increase powers without really looking at some of the concerns with the existing power and addressing that and acknowledging that in the plans for the future.
Yeah, massively. Yeah, for ethnic minority communities is an extra, I think, of course, an extra layer of worry about how these manifestos will cater to them and take shape for them in their everyday lives. I wanted just to pull on some of the conservative points in terms of their stance on racial equality, because we don't
Yeah.
often hear much about the conservatives.
Before we
So
move
in
on to
terms of
that,
their
is that everything to do with the Policing Act, so that we can just on your side?
police, sorry, I'm just scrolling.
No worries. I'll just talk
Right.
about Lib Dems for a little bit. So Lib Dem, they also, outside of the knife crime and the Casey review and the domestic violence stop and search, which I've already mentioned, the Lib Dems are looking at fraud in detail. So they are planning to do a high-profile public awareness campaign on spotting and reporting fraud. Now, I've been the victim of some scams, okay? Like I fell for something and I'm pretty savvy. I remember there was a time when I saw like £2.50 coming out my bank account. Now me, I don't check my bank account. If £2.50 is coming out my bank account, that's whatever. Like I assume I've done something, I've subscribed to something. And then there was just this one day where I saw that £2.50 from whatever name just come out with 25. Now they snitched on themselves, because if they had kept that £2.50, they could have got away with a lot. They just came out of nowhere one month with £25. I was like, no, that wasn't me. I didn't sign up to nothing. Have you ever been scammed?
Oh no, like not in that way. I've fallen for a scam before. I don't talk.
You don't, okay, it's a sore,
No,
still
because
sore.
no, it wasn't. And I don't know why I did it. I felt like I knew I was getting scammed, but I was in lockdown. I just wanted some entertainment. No, I've never lost my bank pass or anything. But I ordered some wigs. There was a deal going, like a 3 for 2. So I said, "Wow, this is really great." So I ordered the wigs, yeah, and I was the whole time I was ordering, I thought, they don't have a return address, but I'm just gonna go for it anyway.
You knew, but you just went for the deal.
I spent over about 60 something quid on the wig. On
Mm-mm.
3 wigs, that's all, and it was too meant to be. It was too good to be true, but I was wanting it to be true. When I tell you that we came, it was looking like some next wear at Halloween. It didn't even have a lace. It was the lace.
At least you got a wig. Like, I'm surprised they even sent you the wig.
They even sent me something, and then I tried to return it. No, I went to my bank to claim fraud, but
And
it was just taking so long, so I left it.
well,
I didn't get frauded. They were like, "Oh, this is not fraud." I said, "It is fraud." I
well,
had to go back and
on that point, Lib Dem are also, in regards to fraud, they want to name and shame the banks with the worst record of preventing fraud and reimbursing victims. So there you go. Maybe if the Lib Dems become power, you can go and get that wig money right back. Get your redemption.
yeah, yeah. 2020 was a rough year for us all.
It was a very rough year. Yeah. Okay, fine. Yeah, that was all I've got on the policing and crime for Lib Dem and Green. So if you're done as well, we can move on to the next
I,
section.
I'm basically done. There's only like one small point from Labour, and that was
Yep.
Labour want to roll out a new network of young future hubs across communities in the UK. So that is to intercept early and keep young people engaged and off the street in regards to knife crime and antisocial behaviour. So these will kind of act as sort of new youth clubs that we often hear about that are no longer in existence for a new generation that the old generation had before. These will include things like youth workers, mental health support workers, and career advisors on hand to support young people's mental health and career progression and development.
Okay, cool. Well, let's move on to health, shall we? So we'll go to health and then we'll come back to just hyper focus on racial equality. So
Yeah.
with health, I guess if you want to start us off then on what's Labour and Conserve saying about health in regards to,
Yeah. So in regards to the NHS, Labour want to look at sort of doubling sort of the capacity of the NHS in regards to facilities they have. So they propose things like new scanners, for example, that will enable people, more scanners in hospitals that will enable people who are potentially suffering from serious illness to be seen quicker. So they're investing about 2 million into this scheme. They hope that this will reduce A&E wait times and increase scanning appointments by up to 40,000 per week as a way of, so this is part of their Fit for Future funds sort of scheme. These will include things like MRI scans to really diagnose life-threatening diagnoses, such as cancer, for example, and brain tumours. They propose to train thousands more midwives as part of the NHS workforce plan and set an explicit target to close the Black and Asian maternal mortality gap. As we know, Black women are disproportionately affected by miscarriage, stillbirth, and are more likely to die during
1
childbirth.
in
We've
5.
seen that through 1 in 5. We've seen that through reports such as Embrace, for example. And most recently from the Birth Trauma Inquiry, which found that about 30,000 women had had traumatic births due to a lack of care in the NHS. So it's really, really promising to see that Labour have, in this particular area, really focused on this racialized and cultural side to what Black and minority ethnic women are dealing with in terms of their birthing plans and how they're aftercare. So very, very strong from Labour. They've proposed a new dentistry rescue plan as well. I haven't seen this from other parties. A real acknowledgement of eradicating new cases of HIV. So Labour will commission a new HIV action plan in England in the pursuit of ending HIV cases by 2030. So a very, very strong manifesto promise there to sort of really confront a disease. Oh God, I don't want to say disease. What's the word? Condition that affect. Very, very strong pledge by Labour there to really kind of combat ending a condition that we know, of course, affects millions across the UK still. So I'm just scrolling and my laptop is very, very slow. We've seen a similar plan by the Conservatives. We're seeing a theme here of reinvesting into the NHS. We know NHS wait times are a struggle. We know getting sort of appointments are a massive struggle. But the Conservatives have pledged that by the end of the next Parliament, there'll be 92,000 more nurses and 28,000 more doctors in the NHS than in 2023. They don't say where that comes from abroad. I know the NHS often runs schemes of bringing over a lot of doctors and nurses from abroad. I don't quite know whether Labour or Conservative are going to really look into that sort of programme scheme. But they're proposing that more healthcare professionals on the ground means you don't have to wait as long. It means you're going to get treated quicker. So they want to really bring healthcare back into the community, not just the hospitals. So expand things like pharmacy first, including menopause support, modernising the NHS, including 250 GP surgeries, and building up to more community diagnostic centres, including 40 new hospitals by, again, 2030. Labour and Conservative both have healthcare targets in regards to that year, and investing proportionately in and out of hospital services over time. Conservatives also really focus on maternal health care off the back of the Birth Traumas Inquiry. I don't quite see from them as much as that sort of racialized cultural focus, but there is an acknowledgement that women are obviously struggling there. They're delivering more funding for maternal safety and improved access to mental health services for new mums, healthcare services to prevent and support women with also birth industries. So they're looking at sort of postnatal appointments as well, and continuing that aftercare after birth. So that is also a very, very strong point in the Conservative manifesto. Very interestingly enough, this kind of feeds in, I guess, into a little bit of the Equality Act that we currently have, as well as what Labour might be proposing in their Race Equality Act, that they want to amend the NHS constitution that is conservative, so it recognises every patient's right to request single-sex accommodation in hospitals and same-sex intimate care. Obviously, in the world we're living in now, that's an ongoing conversation in regards to LGBTQ plus communities and sort of where they fit in the healthcare space. But Conservatives are very, very clear on bringing back the word woman to not be erased by health services, having words such as breastfeeding and mother in a lot of the NHS communication, and having it not be replaced by words such as chest feeding and birthing parent, which they feel erases the presence of women and their identity and the level of, I guess you could say, privacy that should be afforded to them in those spaces. It's an ongoing debate, it's up for debate. But if that is something that you feel deeply about, the Conservatives have made it very clear that they are not erasing the presence of cis women in their healthcare spaces.
Yeah, that's something that
is it cis women?
Yes, cis women, you're correct.
Okay.
What's it called? Well, with the Lib Dems, of course, the points that we're all putting forward here are not the full manifesto and everything that is pledged within it. So please do take your time and do your due diligence to have a look at the manifestos, or keep up to date with the news in regards to hearing about some of the mainstream pledges, I guess. So with that in mind, the Lib Dems, what I've got from them and the Green Party, they have both also said and acknowledged about mental health, of course. So with mental health, for the Lib Dems, they want to modernize the Mental Health Act to strengthen people's rights, control, and choice over their treatment and prevent inappropriate detentions. I thought that was a very strong point, because I do believe it nods its head. It hasn't quite fully said it, but it has nodded its head towards maybe some of the concerns that racialized communities have around detentions. They also want to increase full-time GPs to 8,000, and also, just kind of like you said, making our healthcare a little bit more community-based. They want to give some more prescribing rights to pharmacists, nurse practitioners, and paramedics to free up the GP's time. Back on mental health, now we're talking directly to the police. The Lib Dems want to support the police with adequate levels of training in mental health response, and a mental health professional to be in the control room at all times. Now, this again is very strong, and it nods its head to the concerns yet again around detentions and the whole process, and in which the police plays in that whole kind of like from being called about mental health, and the way that people are treated and put through, and whether they're so that's a nod, not quite a full acknowledgement, but it's kind of giving a little bit more, I guess, care and acknowledgement around that. The Lib Dem have also said that they want to establish an independent pay review body. So I think this is now acknowledging some of the campaigning around pay in the NHS and kind of the medical sector. They want to embed the patient's voice through creating a patient's charter, which gives legal rights to a second opinion. Now, this is very, very interesting. Nothing that I've heard you mention at this point. Also, they want to co-produce plans with communities experiencing the worst health inequalities. So nothing mentioned about intersectionality in regards to that. However, we're moving in the right direction in regards to co-producing with communities to get the best services to at least meet the needs of what they define as the worst health inequalities. Now, what that definition looks like would be interesting if we were to see a Lib Dem government, or at least hear more opinions around that. So that's what the Lib Dem have got to say so far in regards to health. That is of benefit for racialized communities to hear about. In the Green Party, they also have acknowledged mental health. They said that they just want to see mental health seen as quickly as other medical problems, and they want to increase the rights for mental health, for seeking mental health and support in schools, including learning disabilities. Again, kind of like not really too sure how that would work, but I guess it's just kind of giving a general gist of where they would be heading. They want to establish the NHS dental care and a route for lower income people and children to see dental nurses. They want to pay the NHS staff more, and they want to see people treated equally and fairly. So with the Green Party and their pledges, it tends to be very generalistic on what they set out to do, not so specifically. But yeah, they have acknowledged mental health, getting the dental care industry back into the NHS, and paying the NHS staff more, and seeing people treated equally and fairly.
I mean, yeah, we've definitely seen across the board that we've got some, I would say, pretty strong manifestos and promises in regards to health, but a real lacking across the board of that racialized and cultural focus that obviously, especially after COVID, a lot of communities who we saw disproportionately affected were obviously Black, ethnic minority communities. I think it would have been great to see more support for them and how they were going to pick up those sort of I guess you could say vulnerabilities that they're still dealing with. Speaking of sort of racial across the board, I really wanted to. I know we touched on Labour and the other parties in terms of their racial equality efforts. I really wanted to look at the current government, the Conservatives, in terms of their track record for racial equality, which I think would marry up quite nicely with what Labour are proposing with the Race Equality Act. So the Conservatives have not launched any sort of, I guess you could say, in my opinion, hardline plan to tackle racial inequality. In my opinion, I would say they haven't probably got the best track record with people of colour in the UK. Historically, they've often voted for Labour. Arguably, that's now dwindling, but they have historically voted for Labour. So under a Tory government, we saw, the first sort of Black Lives Matter protests that happened that were dismissed. And of course, we saw the resurgence of the Black Lives Matter movement in 2020 after the tragic death of George Floyd. And it took a while for Conservatives, to really respond to the tragedy that happened. I remember previous Prime Minister Boris Johnson did take a few days to really acknowledge what was happening and what Black communities were really feeling. And by the time he had done it, a lot of people didn't take it as sincere. The protests were branded as hooliganism by the previous Home Secretary, Priti Patel, at the time. And we also saw under the Tory government the Sewell Report, which was a report prepared by Tony Sewell, who is a member of the Conservative Party, aka the Sewage Report, because of the sheer contents of it being deemed to be not a true reflection of the Britain we live in today. The report claimed that there was no institutional racism in Britain, which is, in my opinion, very just outrightly, just blatantly wrong, given the stats that we have across the board, even conducted by government itself. We saw in the Ford report, we saw in the Casey review, we saw in the Macpherson report. The government's very own reports contradict this. Their report, which many felt was very much tailored to the benefit of the Conservatives' agenda. They did have some very key members on the board, very high-profile Black figures, which it's worth saying that allegedly they probably weren't consulting about some of the report's content. And overall, the report was accused of gaslighting a lot of sort of Black and minority ethnic people. Having said all of that, we have never had such a diverse cabinet. And that has been under a Tory government. Rishi Sunak, despite the way he came into power, he is still the first British Asian Prime Minister of practicing Hindu that we've had in number 10. We've had Priti Patel, Home Secretary. Suella Braverman was soon followed. People like Sajid Javid and James Cleverly, who have held and continue to hold very, very high positions in government. And often this is used as sort of almost a poster boy or poster girl for a diverse how diverse Britain is and accepting it is that these people now are in incredible positions of power in our government. Arguably, is it a representation? And I
Well,
know you
that's
can
the
probably
real
talk more on this,
question.
Dee. Yeah.
Absolutely. That is the real question. We've seen this debate for some time. And now, I guess, let's take our hats off for a second and talk honestly here. Like, I think there's been a lot of argument for representation matters, right? Seeing yourself in someone in a position that you think to yourself, oh, can I achieve that? Yes, because it's been done by someone who looks like me. That relatability visibly does have a lot of power in itself, right? But where there's a difference is representation of thought, lived experience. That too is also massive, isn't it? And I think what we're seeing in society right now is a lot of conversation and kind of like just ideology around how much does, just physical representation actually matters for communities that, people who come from these communities, these different ethnic backgrounds, how much does that really matter when the very same things that are stood for don't necessarily benefit the community that people come from. So in my opinion, I don't believe that physical representation is representation of thought. I don't believe that represents lived experience. And we should be a little bit more critical at what exactly do people stand for. It's not just about representation. Now that's great, and that does hold and push things forward a little bit. But where it lacks in terms of pushing forward lived experiences and advocating for various communities, we have to be critical and not just be blind to the fact that physical representation means all of a sudden the advancement of equalities for certain ethnic groups are now all of a sudden going to diminish and go, right? So, I mean, where's your kind of stance on that? Does physical representation outweigh thought representation of lived experience for
No,
you?
not for me. We clearly see that the stats, if you want to look at stats across the board, just don't line up with despite representation we have in our government. We've seen, particularly with immigration, that despite that we have such a diverse government whose parents are immigrants and some of them are immigrants themselves, it's not the rhetoric around it. It doesn't marry up with sort of the struggles that a lot of ethnic minority people have faced as refugees and as asylum seekers. And I think it's hard to have a conversation about race in government if we're not talking about class as well.
Absolutely.
And I think that plays a really big part in the sort of the lived experiences that we see. Now, we just saw Rishi Sunak talk about, what struggles he had growing up. And he spoke about how he didn't have access to Sky TV, not a TV in general. It was Sky TV he couldn't get. And I'm not saying we all didn't grow up with those little gripes or we wanted the latest PlayStation or whatever, but it was just such a tone deaf comment to make. And that was a real sort of example of race and class playing itself out if you kind of were able to see into the nuance of it. So I think that's a lot of the reasons why a lot of even British Asians, from conversations I've had with friends, don't feel they can look at someone like Rishi Sunak, an ex-investment banker who's richer than the king, with a net worth of hundreds of millions, and his wife is a billionaire, can take him seriously. Because if we're going to be honest, he can't relate to the struggles of everyday people, and I don't think he's really trying to be honest. In regards to his rhetoric, I think we can see that in the manifesto in terms of racial equality, in terms of how everyday sort of Black and Asian people are feeling. But I will say in the manifesto, he's focused a lot on sort of the Jewish community and having pledged 54 million to the community security trust to give Jewish schools and synagogues and security measures they need allocated additional funding to support schools and universities to understand, recognize, and tackle anti-Semitism. Obviously, we've seen a spike in anti-Semitism due to sort of the current conflict between Israel and Palestine. And that is obviously very horrific. We don't want to see any communities going through any sort of hate crimes because of what's happening in the world. It's just not the way to deal with things. So it's very, very It's good that he's tackling that, and he's also pledging to get the UK Holocaust Memorial built as well, which is a further acknowledgement to Jewish communities in the UK who feel at threat because of what's happening. And they've also taken a stance on sort of Islamophobia, anti-Muslim hatred, and they've promised to seek to stamp it out wherever it occurs. They have committed to providing up to 170 million across 4 years for protective security for mosque schemes. They've said they're proud to support and help fund the Amama's vital work. So I think this is a Muslim community sort of charity organization that also works with protecting sort of Muslims. So we've seen, I think, in my recent times, a real acknowledgement by the Conservatives of inequality that is affecting certain marginalised groups in the UK.
I'm
not
glad you
surprised to
said
see that
certain marginalized groups, because also under the current, I was going to say, it is good to see that there is some acknowledgement of the struggle of certain marginalized groups and religious groups and ethnic backgrounds. However, it is very much in the same light. I would like to acknowledge that we have seen some major campaigns, global campaigns in the last 15 years in regards to anti-Black racism, right? And we've seen it with Black Lives Matter in 2016. We've seen the global response in 2020. We've seen Take the Knee in football. We have seen it in the media. We have seen it in the workplace. We have seen some big cases in regards to how the police address the situation. I can't remember the two ladies who were found, the two sisters who were found, and kind of
Biba and Nicole.
Absolutely. So we've seen some profilic and media. Well, I hate saying the word media worthy because I think everything's media worthy, but let's just say media acknowledged incidents that have taken place. And in terms of seeing that response from the government and from the various parties is also something to take into consideration, because where there is hate, it should be stamped out. And there really shouldn't be a prioritizing or favoritism in regards to the hate that's experienced by communities in this country.
Of course.
In terms of, and I'm interested to find out from you, from your research on Manifesto so far with the Conservatives and Labour, has there been anything to address anti-Black, well, I should say, Black people's experiences and campaigns that we've seen and already spoke on, and those concerns within the manifestos? I can speak a little bit about Lib Dem since I haven't really pulled in what Lib Dem and Green have said so far. So in regards to the Lib Dems, they said that they will implement the Istanbul Convention of Preventing and Combating Violence Against Women and Domestic Violence, with protection for all survivors, regardless of nationality or immigration status. So I guess that is a bit of a nod forward in terms of starting to acknowledge the different experiences by different communities in the UK. Also, the Lib Dems have pledged to provide funding for protective security measures to places of worship, school, community centres that are vulnerable to hate crime and terror attacks. Yet again, another nod forward. Also looking towards political parties, the Lib Dem are looking to make it a requirement for the political parties to publish the candidate diversity data. Now, we spoke a little bit already about, kind of diversity in political parties. So that'd be interesting how and where that could play a part in this whole wider debate on, is it representation, physical representation versus representation of thought and lived experience. You touched on facial recognition earlier for the Conservatives, looking to strengthen that in the police. Well, the Lib Dem would like to halt the use of facial recognition surveillance because they recognize and have stated it in their manifesto, which is most likely to wrongly identify Black people and women. So that acknowledgement is very strong in the Lib Dems manifesto. Again, back on the domestic abuse, it's been acknowledged, providing suitable, sustainable funding for services to support survivors of domestic abuse with a particular focus on community-based and specialist by and for services. So there is some good acknowledgement in regards to what's happening in the racial justice campaigning kind of in the UK. There has been mention of implementing the full Windrush Lessons Learned review without further delay and getting the scheme independent from the Home Office and putting human rights, labour and environmental standards and protection at the heart of international trade deals. So it seems to be really embedding kind of the whole community, but not excluding different community voices in different aspects of living within their manifesto, and there has been, of course, the recognition of, because you brought it up about Palestine earlier, there has been some recognition around kind of some international genocide. So the Lib Dem, they would like to see a ceasefire in the Israel-Gaza conflict and move towards a two-state solution based on the 1967 borders. So that means Israel would have to give some land back. And what else have they got going on here? They would like to support the Afghan refugees in the UK and create legal safe passage for those who wish to leave Afghanistan. And then in terms of the Green Party, I haven't got that much, to be honest. It's more on political reform, media reform and worker rights rather than directly talking about racial equality. So with worker rights, they want to put a right to strike as a new worker right, making it equal, all rights for workers, equal from day one, which is huge, to be honest. As we've seen, the people's power has definitely been threatened, and that does significantly impact racialized communities who have always used campaigning as a way to get their voices heard. So that is good acknowledgement of that. So yeah, anything kind of directly anti-Black racism from
anti-Black racism from
yeah
from the Conservative. No,
from Conservatives or Labour, because it can be done. It's shown in at least the Lib Dems manifesto. It's showing up quite physically with the words "Black" in there. So is there any acknowledgement? And we've seen the criticism about political parties and their acknowledgement.
I haven't seen that real sort of wanting to look at anti-Black racism and the effects of colonialism from the Conservatives. There are streaks of it in the Labour's manifesto, like I said, with maternal health care.
And the Race Equality Act.
And the Race Equality Act. But of course, we've already had concerns from the National Executive Committee on the lack of acknowledgement of the wider issue of the effects of colonialism and far-right extremism, and really dealing with the psyches behind that. Because nothing will work until we really deal with that on an institutional, acknowledge that on an institutional and level, and in a hostile environmental level as well. So I think we've got some promising from Labour to really hone in on that anti-Blackness, because we do know that Black communities on the worst side of the spectrum in a lot of different areas, and we do know about the hierarchy of racism that the full report uncovered, and we do know about proximity to whiteness that obviously a lot of Black people are up against. So it's tricky to say, but I would say if you're going to do a side-by-side comparison, Labour is probably looking the most promising in regards to really working with the Black agenda and how that
in
works
comparison to Conservatives.
In comparison to Conservatives, yes. Yeah. So I just can't stress enough how important it is to do your own research in the lead up to the elections. This is only a synopsis of what's happening out there. Really go and read into your manifestos, contact your local MPs, and really look into issues that you want to see change on a wider scale, as well as in your communities around you. Yeah, I hope that you just use this as a sort of propeller to kind of really go ahead and take the initiative to look into things yourself, really.
Awesome. Well, I guess we can kind of end on that. So thank you, Leah Mahon, for joining and doing this kind of overview of manifestos with me. It's been a very long and hard read of many, many manifestos for a
Yeah.
couple of nights, but we got there.
Yeah. No,
All
it's
right.
been brilliant chatting with you about this.